In the midst of President Donald Trump's latest round of tariffs, global attention turned toward North America, where tensions between the United States and Canada were quietly escalating into a high-stakes economic standoff. While Ottawa emphasized diplomacy and strategic negotiation, Washington appeared to double down on a more theatrical and aggressive approach. At the center of this clash was a stark contrast in leadership styles, one rooted in patience, preparation, and principle, the other in impulse, intimidation, and the relentless pursuit of control. It began like a textbook power play. President Trump, convinced of his ability to bend smaller players to his will, believed Canada would cave under pressure as other nations often did when confronted with the White House's assertive tactics. Initially there were warnings, veiled and overt, aimed at signaling Canada that continued independence in foreign policy could carry a steep cost. These escalated into public jabs, with Trump taking to social media to broadcast his grievances in a blunt, almost theatrical manner, his favorite target Canada's position on Palestinian statehood. Within hours, he framed this policy stance as a reason that new trade deals would be very hard to reach, bypassing private diplomacy entirely. To many observers, this was not merely about tariffs. It was about asserting dominance, about turning trade negotiations into a theater of personal power. France, the United Kingdom, and Mexico had taken positions similar to Canada's without drawing retaliation. So why Canada? The answer lay in the quiet defiance demonstrated under Prime Minister Mark Carney. Unlike others, Canada refused to mold its foreign policy to appease Washington, demonstrating an independence that Trump perceived as insubordination. Ottawa did not flinch. There were no frantic phone calls, no attempts at public appeasement. Instead, Carney and his team doubled down on preparation, strategy, and long-term vision. They recognized that sovereignty, the capacity to make decisions free from external coercion, was a non-negotiable asset. Canadian officials worked quietly but methodically to ensure that economic foundations were secure, while signaling to the world that independence and principled negotiation were integral to national identity. In public, Trump's frustration was palpable. He repeatedly accused Canada of mistreating American farmers, exaggerated tariff impacts, and implied that United States military protection entitled Washington to dictate Canadian economic policy. Yet beneath these accusations was a fundamental misunderstanding. The United States and Canada share one of the world's most integrated and balanced trade relationships. Tariffs are not arbitrary weapons. They are bound by agreements painstakingly negotiated over decades. Trump's portrayal of Canada as an exploited neighbor ignored the deep symbiosis that underpins bilateral trade. Every time Carney rejected a deal that threatened Canadian autonomy, he reinforced a broader principle: agreements must respect sovereignty. Unlike the impulsive Trump approach, which relied on public spectacle and intimidation, Canada's strategy was deliberate, patient, and rooted in preparation. Carney understood that enduring economic resilience was built on independence, not reactionary concessions. The contrast between the leaders could not have been more vivid. Trump approached negotiation as a contest of power, a game of fear and submission. Carney approached it as a test of endurance and foresight. Trump counted on fatigue and intimidation to force compliance. Carney counted on persistence, steady resolve, and careful planning to outlast the unpredictable storms emanating from Washington. Beyond personality clashes, the structure of trade agreements themselves played a decisive role. Canada's updated trade deals included exemptions that shielded nearly 90% of exports to the United States from broad tariffs. These provisions were not accidental. They were the result of careful negotiation, clear rules of origin, and compliance measures. By contrast, Europe and Japan faced broader blanket tariffs with far fewer protections. Trump's threats, while dramatic, were largely ineffective in practical terms. Where Trump relied on stagecraft and public ultimatums, Canada's strength lay in preparation and strategic architecture. The supposed weapon of tariffs had, in effect, been turned into a bluff. This structural resilience meant that even in the face of aggressive rhetoric, the Canadian economy and trade framework remained largely insulated. The contrast in styles reflected a contrast in priorities. One leader focused on spectacle and immediate impact, the other on stability and long-term advantage. The data exposed the tangible costs of Trump's approach. Job numbers for May and June were revised sharply downward, eliminating hundreds of thousands of positions from official records. Employment growth in July barely registered, with only 73,000 new jobs, far below the monthly average. Investors reacted swiftly, sending markets into a tailspin as uncertainty and volatility increased. These statistics were not abstract. They represented real families facing sudden financial strain, workers left idle, and communities navigating economic shockwaves. The trade war, intended to protect American industries, paradoxically destabilized them. Supply chains were disrupted, business confidence eroded, and the broader economy bore the brunt of policy miscalculation. Meanwhile, Canada's measured approach allowed industries to remain operational and competitive, turning external pressures into opportunities for growth. Canada's approach was multifaceted. By diversifying trade partnerships, strengthening domestic production, and maintaining policy consistency, Ottawa turned potential vulnerability into strategic advantage. Carney's government did not merely resist Trump's demands, it created conditions where dependence on the United States was minimized, ensuring economic stability regardless of American unpredictability. Nearly 90% of Canadian exports to the United States were insulated from tariffs, a stark contrast to other countries facing blanket levies. This built-in resilience reduced the effectiveness of Trump's public threats and reinforced the principle that sovereignty cannot be coerced. Where the United States sought immediate concessions through intimidation, Canada relied on preparation, principle, and endurance. Beyond numbers and agreements, this standoff revealed deeper truths about leadership and governance. Trump's tactics, driven by impulse, ego, and image management, prioritized short-term gains over systemic stability. The fallout, job losses, market volatility, and domestic uncertainty, demonstrated the human cost of such an approach. Conversely, Carney's strategy, grounded in foresight and measured decision-making, protected citizens' livelihoods, reinforced industrial capacity, and cultivated international trust. This contrast highlights an essential lesson. Leadership is not just about the ability to wield power, but the capacity to deploy it responsibly. Canadian citizens benefited from a government that valued principle and preparation over spectacle, while Americans experienced the consequences of policy decisions driven by impulse rather than analysis. In the end, Trump's campaign of intimidation achieved little. Public threats, social media outbursts, and exaggerated claims failed to coerce Canada into submission. Ottawa maintained control over its trade policies, safeguarded domestic industries, and preserved sovereignty. American workers and businesses, however, faced the unintended consequences of disrupted supply chains and faltering employment growth. The standoff revealed a larger strategic lesson. Prepared, principled, and resilient approaches can neutralize even the most aggressive forms of pressure. Canada's foresight, planning, and steadfastness not only protected its immediate economic interests but strengthened its position on the global stage. The Canada-US trade standoff is more than a dispute over tariffs. It is a study in contrasting approaches to leadership, strategy, and economic governance. Trump relied on intimidation, public theatrics, and short-term pressure, while Carney relied on endurance, preparation, and principled negotiation. The human and economic stakes were high. Tens of thousands of American workers faced disrupted livelihoods, while Canadian industries continued to operate, shielded by strategic foresight. The lesson is clear. Sovereignty, resilience, and preparation matter far more than rhetoric, ego, or the illusion of immediate control. Canada emerged from this confrontation stronger and more credible, while the United States was reminded of the limits of unilateral power. In a world where economic volatility can ripple across continents, the standoff underscores a fundamental truth. Enduring strength is built on strategy, not spectacle. Preparation, not panic. Principle, not impulse. Canada's experience offers a blueprint for resilience and a cautionary tale about the perils of prioritizing ego over policy.